The Dragon type includes some of the strongest Pokemon out there, and for the longest time, it used to dominate the competitive scene. That is, until Generation 6, and everything changed when the Fairy Nation attacked. So am I going to be able to beat the hardest Pokemon game with Hardcore Nuzlocke rules using only Dragon types? Well, with all those extra rules, it's certainly going to be difficult, and we're going to make it that much more difficult by picking Rowlet as our starter, giving Hau Popplio, which eventually evolves into a Fairy type. But since Rowlet doesn't become a Dragon type, we're not going to be keeping it. Instead, the first dragon we can get is found after the first Gumshoe's trial in Verdant Cavern. And who might this epic dragon be? It's Noibat. If you were expecting something super mega powerful because this run has dragon types, then you were doubly wrong, because not only does Noibat have some of the worst stats in the whole game, dragon types evolve at some ridiculously high levels. On top of that, I got a minus defense nature, which is pretty terrible considering that any Pokemon that faints in this run is boxed forever. I certainly can't complain about the special attack boost though. But the real kicker about getting Noibat as our very first Pokemon is that we have to face a few battles in the game before we can get anything else, the first of which being Dulce. And what's so scary about this fight is that Furfrou will 2-hit KO me with a headbutt, but it just goes for Baby Doll Eyes the first turn, so I can hit it with a Supersonic, confusing it. It then proceeds to hit itself in confusion, which is huge since I can only take 2 headbutts from this thing after my Oranberry. The second turn it breaks through but only goes for Growl, and I get a critical hit with Gust. The third turn it hits itself again, and I hit it down into the red. The fourth turn, however, Furfrou snaps out of confusion, hits me with a headbutt down to where I have to heal with my Oranberry, but it ends up flinching me. Another headbutt takes me down to just 8 HP, and I end up hitting my Gust and not flinching. And crazily enough, this run doesn't get any easier from here on out. You see, right after we take on Dulce, we have to fight Hau, and instead of just one Pokemon, this guy has 3. And to make things a lot worse, his first Pokemon, Popplio, already has a fairy move in Disarming Voice. Now, despite Noibat being absolutely terrible, the Alola starters have pitiful speed, so I can at least get off a Supersonic, and it actually ends up hitting itself in confusion. Then the next turn, I do pretty massive damage with Gust, as an Oranberry takes Popplio up to most of its health, and it snaps out of confusion using Growl. I slap it with another Gust, which is now a 2-hit KO, as it hits me with Disarming Voice, which doesn't do too much damage at all since it's a very weak move and not stab. After taking it out with another Gust, Hau sends out his own Noibat, which gets destroyed by 2 Gusts as well. This just leaves his final Pokemon, Pikachu, which is actually a pretty strong Pokemon at this point in the game, especially if you're running with Noibat. And despite me actually hitting a Supersonic, it hits me with a Thunder Shock, which doesn't do as much damage as I would expect since it's actually neutral and stab. But after Pikachu hits itself in confusion and I get it down into the red with a Gust, it ends up going for a quick attack, taking me down to 10 HP, after which I can finally take it out, beating Hau. And beating this fight is huge since it's the last fight I have to do using only Noibat. In fact, to get my bag on Route 3, I had to look around for 2 hours because this thing is a 1% encounter. But it was certainly worth the wait since a neutral nature is pretty good. It's also pretty funny that I'm so relieved about not only having to use Noibat anymore since the first fight right after that is versus Hala, who's got fighting types, so all I had to do was equip Batman with a sharp beak and blow this man's whole team away. The world looks a bit different from atop a mighty Tauros, huh? Well, you know what they say, Hala. If all you got is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. Now that we know why Hala didn't make it into the Elite Four in the Ultra games, we move on to Akala, and the early game struggle is far from over. I don't know why they did this in Ultra Sun and Moon, but they put a lot of difficult fights in the beginning of the game. And Dexio is no different, but luckily I can take out the Mime Jr. without taking any damage by getting a flinch with Bite. But the real threat in this fight is as Espeon, and I expect to be able to take 2 Psybeams, but he does end up getting the Confusion before I have to heal up with my Citrus Berry. I do end up breaking through Confusion, hitting it with a Bite for above half damage, but if I don't break out the next turn, I'm just gonna take myself out in Confusion and the run's over. Fortunately though, Superman lands the Bite and we don't have to restart the run. You and your Pokemon are the ultimate team, no doubt about it. Are you talking about my team? This is like the weakest team in the history of Nuzlocks. After another run-in with Hal, which I barely make it through, we have yet another difficult fight ahead of us. But this guy's plenty scary. You're not wrong, Hal. One of the more difficult early game fights in this game is Gladion, and it's really the only time that he's particularly difficult. His first 2 Pokemon are easily taken care of by Noibat, but it leaves me at very low health, so I decide to swap out into Superman. The reason this fight's so scary is because Type Null, despite not having great moves, has fantastic stats for this point in the game. At this point in the game, you do have access to both Brick Break and Protect, as well as leftovers, so what I ended up doing is alternating between Brick Break and Protect in order to maximize my recovery as much as possible, because without doing that, I would just go down to 3 tackles. Eventually though, with Batman in the red and Superman down to just 11 HP, I managed to take out Null with a Brick Break, beating Gladion. Now that we've actually made it through Alola's nasty early game, there's something to say about the level caps. See, normally I can't level past the next gym leader's highest level Pokemon, but since there are no gyms in Ultra Sun, I'll be scaling off the 4 Kahunas. I will try and stay as close to the trial levels as possible, it's just that for these early ones in Akala, it's impossible with the current Dream Team. However, even though we're allowed to be at level 28 against Totem Araquanid, we can't level up that far since we have so many fights ahead of us. Because if we overlevel, we have to box that Pokemon until we beat that level cap, and until we beat Totem Lurantis, we're stuck with the Dream Team. And so, at a humble level 23, I managed to hit a Supersonic on Totem Araquanid, and it hits itself in confusion. The reason I didn't want to go for Air Cutter right away is 1, I don't want to get hit by a Roar Beam, but also it would have called Masquerain instead of Dupiter. The second turn, I get some damage in with Air Cutter, Araquanid just hits itself, and Dupiter throws by going for Sticky Web. At this point, another Air Cutter takes out the Dupiter, and the Araquanid actually hits itself a 3rd time in a row, after which it calls in its ally Masquerain. My next Air Cutter then gets a critical hit, which doesn't matter since it would have taken out the Araquanid in the end, but it gets Masquerain down super low as it paralyzes me with Stun Spore. I then get hit by a Bug Bite, which doesn't really do any damage, but funny enough, it does eat my Citrus Berry, but it's still enough to take out the Masquerain with an Air Cutter. All things considered, that fight could have gone way worse. You gotta drive safe and watch out for Pokemon that might leap out at you. Little known fact, that's the exact reason I don't have a driver's license. And the reason why I don't have a driving instructor. Our next fight is versus Totem Marowak, which is a perfect fight to show why I think Ultra Sun and Moon are the most difficult games to hardcore Nuzlocke. The fact that you have to face 2 Pokemon at once during these trial fights can be absolutely devastating. Expecting a Detect the first turn, I go for Rain Dance just to power down Fire-type moves, but mostly just because there's nothing better to do. As Marowak then calls in Salazzle, I go for Protect the next turn since it likes to cycle between attacking moves and Detect. Predictably, the next turn it does exactly that as I get hit by a Torment from Salazzle and I go for a Crunch which lowers Salazzle's defense. I then go for Protect again, continuing to abuse Marowak's Detect and attacking cycle. However, unfortunately, it seems the AI is onto me as the next turn I get hit by a Poison Gas and a Brick Break by Marowak before I can take out the Salazzle with a Crunch. At this point, I'm in a much better spot only facing Marowak one-on-one, but since Bagon's kind of in a tough spot, I swap into Noibat, getting hit by a Brick Break. I was gonna go for Protect here to get as much leftovers recovery as possible, but Marowak went for Detect, so my Protect failed. I can go for Protect again and get double recovery. The next turn, Marowak goes for Detect again, which is perfect since I just use Roost to get back to full health. Marowak then goes for Hex, which is odd since any other move would have done more damage, and I can hit it for some pretty pathetic damage with Water Pulse. After another protection move standoff, I get hit by a Flame Wheel that does about 35% to me, and I go for an Air Cutter, which again does some pretty pathetic damage. A second Flame Wheel takes me down to just 21 HP, but another Roost makes it so that I can take 2 more non-crit Flame Wheels so that I can use Water Pulse twice. I end up going for Protect in between just to have that extra health. The Marowak doesn't end up getting the crit, and I take it out with a Water Pulse, claiming our 3rd trial. Now, so far on Akala, we faced a Water and a Fire trial, and we're about to face Grass, and even though Dragon resists all these 3 types, we're about to have another bad time. I can't believe I'm saying this, but Batman's a pretty good pick in this fight since it resists all of Lurantis' moves, and even a critical hit X-Scissor doesn't do too much damage. The real problem in this fight is the first Pokemon it calls in is Comfey, which can't actually attack us, but it does boost Lurantis' defense and set up Sunny Day. This doesn't exactly threaten me, but as long as Comfey's out, I can't beat Lurantis since it's got both Synthesis in the Sun from Comfey and can be healed by Comfey. However, ironically, Comfey can't heal itself, so after a few turns, I take it out with Air Cutter and it spawns in Kecleon. And I'm honestly surprised how much damage Batman can do with a Brick Break, changing Kecleon into a fighting type. This is pretty sweet, since after a few turns of protecting and roosting, I can hit it again with an Air Cutter, which is now super effective because of its fighting type. Realizing I need to take out this Kecleon and that I'm not going to be able to do so much damage now that it's a flying type, I swap out into Superman. However, on switch in, this does mean that I have to tank a Solar Blade from Lurantis, and the Kecleon ends up getting a critical hit with its Dizzy Punch. Knowing that I'll outspeed it though, the next turn, I can just take it out with a Crunch. Lurantis is at this point out of X-Scissors and can't set up the Sun on its own, but one thing I forgot about is that it got +6 defense from Comfey, so my attacks really aren't doing anything, so I have to swap out back into Batman. The good thing about having Protect though is that we can just protect every other turn and Lurantis can't do anything to us and I can freely just continue going for air slashes, which means we've finally gotten through the Dream Team Gauntlet. You heard me right, now that we have access to wild Pokemon in Lush Jungle, we just have to wait for rainy weather and any Pokemon can actually call Goomy as its ally. Now the great thing about this is we finally have a new team member. The bad thing about it is that Goomy sucks. Seriously, this guy's worse than Noibat. But it's not all bad news since we finally reached Coney City. Here we can pick up the Eviolite, which is pretty huge since we're not going to be evolving for a while. But the best thing about this town is that in Ultra Sun version, you can actually buy the Jaw fossil. And if we head back to Route 8, we can immediately restore it into a Tyrant. Let's just say that attack boosting nature Wonder Woman here is gonna be a bit more useful than Aquaman. What happens to a Pokemon's consciousness when it's been put into a PC box? The big questions aside, we move on to the only one I've ever wanted to pop the big question to, Olivia and her rock types. And her first Pokemon is Anirath, which does have some pretty alarmingly high attack power, doing about 40% with a bug bite, after which I hit it with a crunch, getting the defense drop. Then after getting some recovery from leftovers, I take another bug bite down to 17 HP, after which another crunch is enough to take it out because of that defense drop. Olivia's second Pokemon is Lilip, so I swap out into Aquaman, who's actually gonna get to be useful for once. It hits me with an ancient power, and aside from Giga Drain, that's the only attacking move it has, so I start doing some damage with Dragon Breath. The only thing that could really screw us over here is if the Lilip managed to get the Omni boost off of Ancient Power. The plan here is to get Lilip to as low health as possible, and then as it uses its fifth Ancient Power, I swap out into Tyrant. Now I did manage to get the paralysis on one of my Dragon Breaths, so while she used a full heal, I did get one extra hit in before it's time to swap out into Superman on the final Ancient Power. The only reason I did this is so that Lilip will be at low enough health so we can one-shot with a Brick Break so that we have as much health as possible facing Lycanrock. After getting flinched once, I get hit by a second bite and manage to hit a Brick Break, which does about half health. The next bite gets a crit, but it doesn't flinch, and we manage to pull off the Brick Break, beating the Akala Island Grand Trial versus Olivia. This means we can finally head on to Ula Ula Island. When your Pokemon evolve, you think they feel like, yes, finally. Well, in the case of my Bagon, who's now allowed to reach level 30 and is the first Pokemon on my team to evolve after about the first half of the game, I'm at least ready to say it's finally time. And unfortunately, it's also finally time for the infamous Mally-How fight. Now, the biggest reason why this fight is so difficult at this stage in the game is because he does have a fully evolved Alolan Raichu with Thunderbolt and Psychic. He's also got a Tauros with Intimidate that's got Pursuit, which is particularly unforgiving. But before we face them, we do have to take out Brionne, which isn't really a problem for Eviolite Shelgon. And Eviolite's the entire reason that this Psychic doesn't just one-shot me right here and I can retaliate with a Crunch, taking out the Raichu. This means Tauros is next, and with that Intimidate, we're not going to be doing a lot of damage, and we don't have that much health to go around, so I swap out into Wonder Woman, who at least resists its Stab Horn attack. And after a few charms, we can just start taking care of the rest of Hau's team like it's no problem. I thought that was going to be a way more difficult fight, but Eviolite is one heck of an item. However, now that we beat Hau, we need to worry about the Ula Ula Island trials, which are some pretty difficult ones with the current set of Pokemon we have. First up is Togedemaru, which usually goes for Spiky Shield the first turn, so I take that opportunity to set up a free Rock Polish. Togedemaru then calls Skarmory, which is another Steel type, which isn't that great for Wonder Woman, but I'm really only here to use Charm. After Skarmory uses Tailwind, Togedemaru does outspeed the next turn and go for an Iron Head, and I get hit by a hard Steel Wing, but I manage to go for a Charm on the Skarmory as well. Another Iron Head takes me down into the red as Skarmory sets up Stealth Rocks, and I manage to use another Charm on Togedemaru before it's time to swap out into Batman. Now, Batman isn't exactly the bulkiest Pokemon out here, but the plan is just to try and burn an Iron Head, then use Protect and swap out into my next Pokemon. And once again, it's gonna be Aquaman's time to shine, because with -4 attack and -2 on the Skarmory, it's gonna be pretty easy to live a few hits, especially with leftovers and Protect every other turn. On the turns when I wasn't using Protect, I was using Dragon Breath to try and just get some damage on this Skarmory. It also helped that Togedemaru was basically using Spiky Shield every other turn on the turns I wasn't using Protect, so I could dodge its damage all the time and eventually land a paralysis on Skarmory. And this process continued for a long time. You see, my goal goal was to have Togedemaru run out of Iron Heads completely, but I definitely didn't want to take out Skarmory so that it would call Dedenne, and eventually I achieved my goal. And this put me in an excellent position since -4 resisted Zing Zap basically did nothing to me. This also meant that it was pretty much free to start attacking this thing, and since it had +2 defense and I had to alternate between Crunch and Brick Break because of Torment, it took quite a while, but eventually we took down both Togedemaru and Skarmory. Well, if you're done here, Miss Unova, could I ask you to do a favor for me? Oh, for the last time, Sophocles, I'm not gonna sign your Now, you might think it's smooth sailing until we get to the next trial, but we actually have a bit of a mini boss fight versus Guzma here where he only has 2 Pokemon, but his Masquerain is a massive deal. But first we have to deal with Golisopod, so I go for Protect to dodge the first impression, and the next turn I decide to go for a Charm as I dodge a Sucker Punch. I then go for another couple of Charms as I get hit by some weak Razor Shells, after which it's time to swap out into Aquaman. I basically just do this to reset the defense drops from Razor Shell on Wonder Woman, hit this thing with a Dragon Breath, and then swap right back in. This time, I don't get a defense drop from the next Razor Shell, and I can set up a Stealth Rock, which is gonna take half of Masquerain's health as soon as it comes out. And now that the rocks are up, it's time to swap out into Batman, and my plan here was basically just to alternate between Protect and Roost until Golisopod was all out of moves except for First Impression. Now that that's the case, we can just start going for Crunch until Golisopod gets below half health, after which Emergency Exit will activate, sending in Masquerain, which unfortunately does have Intimidate, lowering our attack. I know this means we'll probably have to swap into and sack Aquaman because it's a 2-hit KO, but I end up getting a critical hit, beating the Masquerain, which trivializes this fight a lot. And since we stalled out Golisopod of all of its remaining moves, we can freely just take it out with a couple of Dragon Claws, beating Guzma. Master, I'm sorry, I failed you. Now that we're able to reach Blush Mountain, it's finally time for us to get our very first actual good Pokemon, Turtonator. And to quickly read you its Shield Pokedex entry, eating sulfur in its volcanic habitat is what causes explosive compounds to develop in its shell. Its droppings are also dangerously explosive. That sounds like the worst kind of explosive diarrhea. And now that the team is looking stronger than ever, it's time to take on the next trial versus Mimikyu. And even though we've been through the ringer so far, this is probably going to be the most difficult one yet. In fact, right away, Wonder Woman gets taken down to just 12 HP, after which I can hit the Mimikyu with a Charm. It then calls its first ally Pokemon, Banette, after which I obviously have to swap out into Superman. Fortunately, the Mimikyu misses the play rough on the switch, and the Banette afflicts me with a curse. This is going to do a quarter of my health every single turn, but even still, I decide to stay in to tank the play rough, but I get hit by a Will-O-Wisp from the Banette, which means that it just barely hangs on after the crunch. And at the end of the turn, after the leftovers recovery, burn, and curse, it leaves me deep in the red, so I have to swap out the next turn into Manhunter. Now, the great thing about this is that Play Rough isn't super effective against Turtonator, I can't get burned, and my defense is massive. I decide to go for Protect just to get some health back, and the next turn I get hit by a Play Rough and then a Screech, which means that I can take out the Banette with a following Flamethrower. At this point, since Mimikyu's only going to call for Jellicent when it's at a certain health range, I decide to swap out into Batman just to reset that Screech. But Play Rough ends up doing a ridiculous amount of damage, leaving me at just 6 HP, so I go for Protect to just stall another Play Rough and then swap back into Martian Manhunter. And listen, this is the third notable fight in a row where I deplete the PP of a move as my strategy. At this point, you might as well call me Joe, cause I do be stallin'. And what you're seeing me do here is set up as many iron defenses as possible, because even though Shadow Claw has a higher chance to land a critical hit, the Battle Armor ability makes it so that it can't crit us whatsoever. Since there's no way for me to actually boost my attack power here, I decided to just go for Flamethrowers and really hope I can land a burn. Eventually, Mimikyu gets to low enough health where it decides to call in its ally Jellicent. As you can see, Water Pulse isn't doing a crazy amount over time, so at least I can go for Protect every other turn to recover up as much health as possible with leftovers. Fortunately, it has a really bad habit of going for Spite, which means that we just get a free turn to fire off a Flamethrower, which means that after taking another Water Pulse, we can finally take out the Mimikyu. We're not exactly out of the woods here yet though, since we still have to deal with this full HP Jellicent, and I just have Iron Head to damage this thing, which basically does nothing. At such low HP, I have to swap out into Gumi, who tanks the Water Pulse like a champ, but unfortunately gets confused. A combination of Nightshade and hitting myself in confusion takes me down to just 34 HP, which is terrible since Jellicent is level 33, meaning that Nightshade does exactly 33 damage. The bad spot Spite habit lets me get off a second Shockwave, meaning we can take it down with yet another one, but Cursed Body bans it. Nightshade then takes me down to 1 HP, and Dragon Breath doesn't quite take out the Jellicent, meaning that if Shockwave wasn't Cursed Bodied, we would have just taken it out right here. Unfortunately though, the team is standing on its last legs, so Gumi is gonna have to take this one for the team so the Batman can come in and just finish off the Jellicent with a Shadow Ball. Oh, Aquaman, now you truly are useless. Now that we've completed the trial and our next important fight is at level 44, I decide it's finally time to evolve Tyrant into Tyrantrum. I also pay a visit to Hyana Desert, where we can get our next encounter, a Trapinch. And while Green Lantern might not be a dragon type yet, after just a couple of levels, it evolves into Vibrava. And now that we've gotten some justice for the fall of Gumi, we have to take on our next opponent, Kahuna Nanu. And with the exception of Hala, he's pretty much been the first fight in this game that's been an absolute pushover. However, one very good thing did come out of that fight, and it's the fact that the level cap is now raised up to level 54, which means Vibrava can finally evolve into Flygon. And with that, we proceed to the Aether Paradise, where we have to take on Guzma for the third time in this game. And much like every other time you face him, he leads off with Golisopod, so I decide to lead with Wonder Woman, and this time, instead of going for Protect, I just tank the first impression and go for a Charm. I then go for another Charm the next turn and decide it's time to swap out into Martian Manhunter. The thing that's so deadly about this is that Turtonator can't be crit because of shell armor, so I can freely just boost my defense every single turn and then start going for Shell Smash to set up my attack and speed. And this right here is the exact reason why I didn't show the second Guzma fight, because it pretty much went down the exact same way. I just set up against Golisopod and then tore through his entire team. But I'm glad we didn't have to break too much of a sweat with this one, because what's to come is rough. Hey, what's up with you? How come I can't smash you? That's pretty ironic, coming from a guy who just got shell smashed. On the topic of people Guzma would like to smash, we have to go up against Lusamine. And she starts out with our worst nightmare, a fairy type in Clefable, and she instantly goes for Charm as I decide to go for a Shell Smash. I then go for an Iron Head, actually managing to pull off the flinch, which means I can get in another Iron Head, after which Clefable uses Hyper Voice, which does massive damage. However, a third Iron Head is enough to take out Clef. But really, this just makes things a lot worse, since this Milotic has both Dragon Pulse and Icy Wind. But for whatever reason, it decides to go for Hydro Pump against Superman, and on the following turn, it just goes for another Hydro Pump as I hit it with a Toxic. I then go for Protect just to rack up as much damage as possible over time, and the next turn it continues to go for Hydro Pump, leaving me at 21 HP, after which I can hit it with a Crunch. Now, after going for Protect, I realize that I can't switch anything in on our Dragon Pulse, so I decide to just sack off Superman here, but I end up getting the double Protect, so I guess Superman's sticking around. On top of that, that means bye-bye for Milotic, but in comes Lopunny, which does have Ice Punch, so I decide to swap into Wonder Woman, who's got great defense. It then switches to Thunder Punch as I start going for Charm to lower this thing's attack, and honestly, it seems like this Lopunny does this a lot of the times in my runs. It just swaps out into a move that's not very effective, and if anybody in the comments could tell me why, that'd be greatly appreciated. But at this point, since this thing's attack is basically zero, I can just swap out into Martian Manhunter, who once again can't be crit, so I can freely set up my Shell Smashes. And at this point, we can just freely take out the rest of her team, and because of Superman's clutch save, we didn't actually lose a single Pokemon in this fight, which I wouldn't have expected. And with Lusamine defeated, there's nothing standing in our way to move on over to Pony Island. Once there, I start farming as many damage-reducing berries as possible, specifically Haban and Roselli berries. Then, after all this time, after defeating this Hula Girl in order to receive a Focus Sash at level 48, Batman finally evolves into Noivern. And speaking of upgrading the team, now that we can reach Executor Island, we can find, well, Executor. I go ahead and catch it and name it after the best Justice League member, Elongated Man, and with a neutral nature, I'm pretty happy with it. That's another Habanberry. I then head over to Vast Pony Canyon, where we can find yet another dragon type, Jang Mo-O. And you know what? Since this guy saved the day versus Lusamine, I think it's time we evolve. Is that a bird? Or is it maybe a plane? No, it's Salamence. And now that the team's looking pretty goated, you might think that things are about to get super easy. Well, that would be wrong, because the next three fights in this game are the most threatening to our team despite our new lineup. And the first of those 3 fights is versus Totem Komodo, and theoretically, we have a good matchup versus this fight as well. It's just that it gets all its stats boosted and calls an ally Pokemon. And I use my first turn to poison the Komodo with Toxic as it goes for Dragon Claw, but I've got a Habanberry just so that Batman can survive the hit. Then after taking some poison damage, Komodo of course calls its ally Pokemon its own Noivern. I decide to then go for Protect to get a little bit more poison damage before it's time to swap out into Superman. Because of Intimidate, we are going to bring the attack stat of Komodo down to neutral, and as we get hit by Dragon Claw, another one of our farmed Habanberries is going to reduce that damage, which means we can survive the Dragon Pulse. We only just barely survive, but the next turn I go for Protect yet again to burn another turn of Toxic before it's time to swap out once again to Martian Manhunter. Pertinator does have by far the best defenses on the team, but yet another Habanberry makes it so that we can survive both hits and the next turn go for Protect to burn another turn of Toxic. This being the 6th turn of Toxic does mean that Komodo goes down to Poison, but we still have to deal with this Noivern that's super fast. I decide it's time to swap into Executor, who even without a Habanberry can survive the Dragon Pulse above half health. After then going for a turn of Protect and tanking another Dragon Pulse, I decide to hit it with a Psyshock for a little bit of damage. After then yet again going for Protect, this means that Noivern only has 1 more PP of Dragon Pulse left, so I decide it's time to swap out into Green Lantern, who can survive it with another Habanberry. And at this point, even though Noivern is faster and would take us out with a Dragon Pulse, it doesn't have any PP left, so we can just freely take it out with a Dragon Claw, winning us the trial. And while it was possible to plan for that Dragon trial, Ultra Necrozma is built different. I mean seriously, during my calculations, even holding a Habanberry, this thing would one-shot every single Pokemon on my team. And so to be able to proceed past this fight, massive sacrifices are going to have to be made. I did mention earlier that I went out of my way to grab that Focus Sash just so that we're going to be able to use Toxic. I then go for Protect, and realizing that Elongated Man is just going to get taken out, I click Protect again and end up getting the double. Now I don't even know if Triple Protect is possible, and unfortunately here Elongated Man is going to have to go down, but we got 4 turns of Toxic out of it, which means we only need 2 more turns of Poison, so of course I click Protect the first turn. And at this point, anything I swap in is just going to get absolutely annihilated by Ultra Necrozma, so I just decide to go for the 1 in 4 chance to get the double Protect, and somehow, by the grace of Lord Helix, we actually managed to pull it off, which means I've gotten 2 clutch double Protects in this fight alone, and 1 versus Lusamine. I suppose this answers the question of who would win in a fight, Superman or Ultra Necrozma. After saving the day, the Ultra Recon Squad does offer us a Poipole, which does evolve into a Dragon type, but I've elected not to use it because Naganadel has some super busted stats, and pair that with the Beast Boost ability, together with its Poison type that would trivialize the next trial, I think we're just gonna skip it. But since we did lose Elongated Man, we are gonna bring Flash onto the team, who I immediately evolve into Hakamo'o and then into Komodo. But if we're entirely honest, Komodo being quad weak to Fairy is not gonna be much help against this trial versus Rabombi with +2 to every single stat. And I sat for a really long time trying to come up with a super fun strategy for this fight, some cool way to beat it, but they just involved too many casualties. In a challenge like this, where you have a fight that could totally annihilate half your team, but you still have a good portion of the game left, you kinda have to play it safe, so I go for a Toxic before Rabombi calls in Pelipper. I then go for Protect, and seeing that I'm not going to be able to do any damage to Rabombi anyway, I attempt for the double Protect as I then get hit by a +3 Dazzling Gleam, which does a ton of damage. I then go for another Protect, after which I have to swap out into someone, so I go into Superman, who has the best special defense on the squad except for Turtonator, who then gets hit by a Dazzling Gleam, but my Roselli Berry allows me to survive. The Rain Boosted Scald is at least resisted, so I get taken down to just 38 HP, after which I can freely go for the final Protect on turn 6, taking out the Rabombi. We do still have to deal with the Pelipper, but since the rain stopped and it can only hit us with not very effective moves, I just switch in Batman, who can swoop in with a few air slashes, finishing off this trial. And I'm incredibly grateful that I was able to get through this fight without any casualties, meaning that we have a full team of 6 going forward. But even though we got through the fights that are the most obviously threatening to our team, we have a lot more to go in this game. And the next fight happens to be the Grand Trial of Pony Island versus Hapu and her ground types. But after an Intimidate from Superman and a Charm from Wonder Woman, I swap out into the Flash, who boosts its speed with a Rock Polish and then boosts its attack all the way up to +6 with Workup. After that, I can just rip through Hapu's entire team in true Justice League fashion, winning us our final Grand Trial. I then make sure to pick up as many heart scales as possible to relearn moves for our final moveset against the Elite Four, and so I nervously summit Alola's highest mountain in order to take on the final gauntlet of Ultra Sun. And the first Elite Four member I decide to get out of the way is the Golfer Kahili. She's definitely the one I felt the most confident against because Alola has some pretty nutty Elite Four members. I decide to start with Wonder Woman because not only does she have the highest defense on the team, she also resists flying with her rock type. The first turn, I set up my Stealth Rocks, and then after having to tank another Brave Bird, which is barely doing any damage at all, I go for a Crunch doing way more than half damage. Another Crunch takes out the Braviary, and Kahili sends out her Hawlucha. Obviously, I can't stay in against a fighting type, so I decide to swap out into Superman to not only get the Intimidate, but we can also easily just take this thing out with a Fly. Now, Kahili's next Pokemon is Manda Buzz, and this thing doesn't exactly have anything that threatens us, so I decide to just go for a Thunderfang, which is a 2-hit KO, but it hits us with Flatter, which means I have to swap out the next turn. I tag out into Batman, who can easily finish off the Manda Buzz with a Dragon Pulse. Then, since Toucanon is our next opponent, I decide to swap out into Superman to get that Intimidate to lower the attack. And I'm very glad that Superman has Intimidate because I get hit by a Supersonic Sky Strike down to just 15 HP. At this point, I obviously can't stay in, so I go ahead and swap into Flash, which is when I learn that it's actually immune to Beak Blast because of Bulletproof. It also seems like the AI doesn't really realize that it can't use Beak Blast because I can freely just set up a Belly Drum here and heal up a little bit with Citrus Berry before I just dodge another Beak Blast. It also allows me to just get a free Rock Polish, after which I can just start tearing through the rest of Kahili's team, winning us our first Elite Four fight. But Kahili's just the tip of the iceberg because we have a way worse matchup against the rest of these Elite Four members, the first of which I decide to take on is Acerola. She starts out with Banette, so I decide to send in Batman, and my plan was just to one-shot this thing with a Shadow Ball, but it seems to survive on what must be 1 HP, after which it just goes for Screech. Fortunately, this gives me the opportunity to just take it out with another Shadow Ball, as Acerola then sends in her Frostlass. She goes for an Ice Shard, but a Yacha Berry allows me to survive even after that -2 from Screech, and I go for a Flamethrower, which just barely misses out on the KO once again. Not wanting to be taken out, I decide to swap into Manhunter, who takes barely any damage from Ice Shard at all. Unfortunately, I do get hit by a Confuse Ray the next turn, but Martian Manhunter, being the monster that it is, manages to pull off a Flamethrower anyway, taking out the Frostlass. This means Palossand is up next, and expecting an Earth Power, I swap out into Superman to dodge it. I then decide to do some damage with Crunch, but it does a pretty pitiful amount, but at least I get the defense drop. Palossand then hits me with a never-ending Nightmare, which is the second time a Z-move takes me down into the red. Expecting a Shadow Ball, I swap into Flash, who's immune to it with Bulletproof, and then expecting an Earth Power, I swap out into Superman once again to dodge it. I realized at this point that I found a double immunity pivot. As long as I kept switching between Bulletproof and a flying type, there was nothing this Palossand could do to stop me. And so you get to witness the return of Antler Joe live, stalling this thing out of all of its moves. Eventually, the only attacking move Palossand had left was Giga Drain. With that in mind, I can quad resist Grass by switching into Turtonator and start trying to do a bit of damage to this thing with Flamethrower. Although, Acerola didn't really seem to like that plan since she immediately swapped out into Delmise after getting hit by 1. I didn't exactly see that as a huge hindrance since we can just two-shot it with Flamethrower, leaving just Palossand and Drifblim. Acerola's Drifblim only has Ominous Wind as its attacking move, but what it can do is go for Amnesia and then baton pass that out to Palossand. And even though that means Palossand's going to be able to tank Flamethrowers better, it really just prolongs the inevitable since it can only hit me with Giga Drain. After Palossand goes down, all Acerola has left is her Drifblim that only can use Ominous Wind, which promptly goes down to Toxic. At this point, we've defeated 2 of the 4 Elite Four members, which means we have to take on the girl of my dreams. You could even call her my rock, Olivia. She starts the fight with Armaldo, and I match her fossil to fossil with my best defender, Wonder Woman. She hits me for about 25% damage with an X-Scissor as I set up my Stealth Rocks. Another X-Scissor hits me down into the yellow as I go for a Charm to lower the attack of this thing. Because of that, I can tank another X-Scissor and hit it with another Charm to basically render this thing useless. I even take the next turn to pivot out into Superman just to get it to -5 with Intimidate, and it basically does nothing to me with X-Scissor. I then get an absolutely free switch in into Flash, who can dodge Rock Blast with Bulletproof, and then freely set up a Belly Drum against this thing since it basically can't touch me. Then after a Rock Polish, I can one-shot every single Pokemon on Olivia's team, including Probopass, because we broke the Sturdy with that Stealth Rock, which means we can at this point move on to the final Elite Four member, Molayne. And he could definitely present us with a bit of challenge since Steel types do resist Dragon types. I lead off with Wonder Woman, who I've given a Babiri Berry in case this Klefki wants to go for Flash Cannon, try to one-shot me so that I can get up my Stealth Rocks. After the deed is done, I swap into Martian Manhunter as the Klefki starts to set up spikes. At this point, I was kind of expecting getting paralyzed by this thing's Thunder Wave, but it just goes for Flash Cannon, so I get to use Flamethrower. The next turn, the Klefki repeats the exact same odd behavior, and at this point, I can just take it out. This, of course, means that Molane's going to want to swap in his Dugtrio to be able to take out Turtonator with an Earthquake. This right here is an obvious opportunity for us to swap into Superman to start intimidating down the Dugtrio. I then swap back into Turtonator, and even though this isn't as good a switch as versus Acerola, where we were immune against both moves, at least it can't do too much damage with Iron Head, or in this case, Corkscrew Crash. And even though Dugtrio isn't going to be able to use its Z move every turn, this is the exact pattern I went through. Protecting after the Iron Head to dodge an Earthquake, I then swap back out into Superman to waste yet another Earthquake and get an Intimidate, and as soon as Dugtrio had gotten down to -6 attack, I figured it was safe to just swap out into Flygon. Now Dugtrio is faster than Flygon, so it could have easily gotten a flinch on this first Iron Head, but it wouldn't have mattered too much since I would have just wasted a few turns until I got my first Dragon Dance and then just set up to +6. Then once all my boosting was done, I could just start clicking Earthquake and take out every single Pokemon on Molane's team, including Magnezone, because we set up those Stealth Rocks the very first turn. And now that we've made our way through the Elite Four unscathed, we have one final opponent to face, our rival Hau. And this guy's got a pretty frightening team of 6, leading off with Raichu, so I choose to lead with Green Lantern. And against Raichu, I know I can tank at least one Psychic, meaning I can get off a free Earthquake here, which is obviously a one-shot. Since Flygon's quad weak to Ice, this is going to bait out Crabominable, and wanting to save Flygon for later, I swap out into Turtonator. After dodging the Ice Hammer, I take massive damage from a Stone Edge, after which I hit it with a Flamethrower, which takes it down low and gets the burn. Because of this, Hau decides to withdraw Crabominable, sending in Noivern, which I do basically no damage to with a Flamethrower, but funny enough, I get the burn here too. Getting that burn seems to make Hau switch because he then swaps into Flareon as I try to protect. But this Flareon's moveset is absolutely pathetic against Turtonator since it can only hurt us with Flare Blitz or Quick Attack. This means that I can very easily just go for a Toxic, stall for a few turns with Protect, and then wait for it to go down to Poison. Next up is Tauros, who probably two-shots Turtonator with an Earthquake, but I decide to just swap out into Superman to both get an Intimidate and dodge the Earthquake. At this point, the most logical thing for Tauros to do is to do as much damage as possible with a Double Edge, so I go ahead and swap out into Flash to tank it. The next turn, the Tauros does outspeed me, but I can still survive even a critical hit, and a close combat is obviously enough to take it out. Unfortunately though, this does mean that Hau's next Pokemon is going to be Primarina. And despite being able to outspeed and even doing some pretty decent damage with close combat, there's no way that the Flash is outrunning that quad weakness to Fairy. And to be completely honest, I don't have too many options against this Primarina, so I send in Superman and go for a Thunderfang, which doesn't quite take it out, and while Superman gets powered up by the sun, it seems it gets taken out by the moon. I then send in Flygon as Hau goes for a full restore on Primarina, and I go for an Earthquake hoping it does above half, but it just barely does below. I click Earthquake again to get it as low as possible, but I end up getting a high roll, actually just taking out the Primarina. Predictably, Crabominable comes back, but since I can just outspeed with Flygon and the Crabominal's in the red, I can just take it out with an Earthquake. At this point, Hau only has Noivern left, but I can't swap anything into a Dragon Pulse, so unfortunately we have to let Flygon go. However, because of Flygon's noble sacrifice, we can end this thing the way we started it and send in Batman, finishing off Hau's Noivern with a Dragon Pulse. And that's how I beat a Pokemon Ultra Sun Hardcore Nuzlocke using only Dragon types. I thought I was going to lose this thing so many times, and I was ready to give up on this run and just do something else, but in the end, we pulled through. And listen, if you're at this point in the video and you're not subscribed to the hey Turtonator, what are you doing?